On February 20th of 1945, the black volcanic sands of Iwo Jima seemed unbreakable after weeks of relentless bombardment. Japanese defenders, hidden in bunkers and tunnels, believed nothing living could cross that scorched ground. When the American Shermans appeared, they looked like the same old machines that had been targeted across countless battles. Yet as their turrets swung, the familiar roar of steel never came. Instead, a strange hiss released a torrent of liquid fire that arced through the air and poured into concrete defenses, consuming them in seconds. The bunkers that had resisted shells and bombs dissolved in a storm of flames hotter than anything the Pacific had witnessed. What followed was a moment of shock and disbelief, as a weapon, born of American industry, transformed the battlefield into an inferno. On that day at Iwo Jima, the war entered a new chapter, one that no soldier on either side could ever forget. Iwo Jima, 8 square miles of volcanic rock, was never meant to become a household name in America. It was small, barren, and inhospitable, the surface scarred by sulfur vents and jagged ridges. Yet in early 1945, this speck of land became one of the most critical pieces of real estate in the Pacific War. Its location halfway between the Marianas and the Japanese mainland made it indispensable. From its airfields, American bombers could launch raids on Tokyo, while Japanese forces could use it to intercept those same bombers and stage counterattacks. It was the knife's edge of the Pacific. For the men who landed there, the island was more than strategic. It was a vision of hell. Marines described the volcanic ash as unlike any sand they had ever seen. Each step sank them ankle deep, their legs burning from exhaustion as if they were walking through wet cement. Smoke from burning bunkers mixed with the island's natural sulfur stench, creating a choking haze. The sound of battle never ceased. Artillery, thunder, machine guns hammering, planes roaring overhead. Iwo Jima wasn't just a battlefield. It was a furnace. The Japanese had transformed this tiny island into a fortress. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the man chosen to command its defense, knew Japan could not win. He told his staff plainly, Iwo Jima would fall. But how it fell was what mattered. His mission was to bleed the Americans so heavily that Washington might reconsider invading the Japanese homeland. To accomplish this, he abandoned centuries of tradition. There would be no glorious banzai charges, no warriors hurling themselves into suicidal attacks. Instead, his 21,000 men would vanish underground. By the time the Americans arrived, 11 miles of tunnels honeycombed the island. Entire battalions could disappear beneath the volcanic surface. 5,000 caves had been carved by hand, linked by passageways that allowed defenders to appear where least expected. Hospitals, ammunition depots, and command centers were buried beneath 60 or 70 feet of rock. Concrete bunkers capped the surface, their apertures hidden until they opened fire. Artillery was positioned with mathematical precision, creating kill zones that overlapped like invisible webs. Kuribayashi's design was radical and terrifying. His orders to his soldiers were simple. Do not waste your life in futile gestures. Kill 10 Americans before you die. The goal was arithmetic: force the invaders to pay so steep a price in blood that victory would feel hollow. American intelligence underestimated him. For 74 consecutive days, bombers had pounded the island. Battleships unleashed more than 22,000 shells. Commanders believed nothing could have survived. Estimates predicted the island would fall in 5 days. When the Marines hit the beaches on February 19th, they thought they were walking into ruins. What they faced instead was a storm of hidden firepower. Casualties on the first day were staggering. More than 2,000 Marines killed or wounded in less than 24 hours. Tanks bogged down in ash. Artillery fire rained from unseen positions, and every attempt to advance collapsed under machine gun fire. By nightfall, the Americans had gained only a few hundred yards. It was into this crucible that a new weapon rolled ashore. 8 Sherman tanks, unlike any others. On the surface, they looked identical to the hundreds of Shermans already in service. But hidden inside their turrets was a system created in secrecy at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii, a flamethrower mechanism capable of projecting burning napalm more than 100 yards. To the Marines, they were experimental. To the Japanese, they were unimaginable. When the first of these tanks opened fire on February 20th, the battlefield changed. Concrete pillboxes that had withstood days of bombardment crumbled in minutes. Defenders who had sworn to fight to the death fled in panic, their courage no match for rivers of flame. The Marines, who had suffered catastrophic losses the day before, suddenly found the enemy breaking before them. The island, built to be a fortress, was about to become a crematorium. Iwo Jima, already hellish, was about to burn like nothing the Pacific War had seen before. The flamethrower tank was born not from theory, but from desperate necessity. By early 1944, American commanders across the Pacific were confronting a deadly equation. Conventional firepower could kill, but not dislodge Japanese defenders in caves and bunkers. Artillery blasted entrances, bombs collapsed walls, yet soldiers hidden deep underground emerged unharmed once the smoke cleared. Portable flamethrowers, carried by infantry, offered one solution, but the price in blood was horrific. Marine flame operators were marked men. Their tanks of fuel on their backs became bullseyes. Casualty rates soared above 70%. Some units lost 9 out of 10 operators within hours of combat. It was clear that if America was to break the fortress islands of the Pacific, it needed a new kind of weapon, one that could bring fire where bullets and shells could not, while protecting the men who wielded it. The answer came from engineers, not generals. At Schofield Barracks in Hawaii, Colonel George Unmocked, a veteran of chemical warfare development, was tasked with creating something the manuals did not describe: a tank that could breathe fire. Unmocked assembled an unusual team. Machinists from the Navy's Seabees, electricians, Marine tank crews, and Army chemical specialists worked side by side. They were not bound by rigid doctrine. They were bound by necessity and by time. The battle for the Marianas had already shown the scale of Japanese fortifications. Saipan, Peleliu, and Leyte were killing grounds. The next target, Iwo Jima, promised to be worse. Failure to innovate would mean thousands more American dead. Their work was grueling. Welding shops in Hawaii glowed around the clock. Crews cannibalized existing flamethrower designs, merging the Canadian Ronson system, the Navy Mark I, and even captured German blueprints. They labored 20 hours a day, often sleeping beside the machines they were modifying. Every mistake cost time, and time was measured in Marine lives. The breakthrough came with the M4A3 Sherman. Unlike the lighter tanks used earlier, this vehicle had the armor to withstand Japanese anti-tank fire. Its main gun was stripped and replaced with a flame projector, capable of traversing nearly 300 degrees. Inside, tanks held nearly 300 gallons of napalm-thickened fuel, pressurized by nitrogen. In combat, it could fire streams of flame more than 150 yards, 3 times farther than any man-portable flamethrower. The men who built it knew they were creating something terrible. Yet when they watched demonstrations on the lava fields of Hawaii, they saw bunkers vanish in seconds. Concrete cracked, steel doors warped, and targets once invulnerable were reduced to molten wrecks. For the first time, American commanders believed they had a weapon that could neutralize the underground strongholds awaiting them. By February 1945, 8 of these modified Shermans were ready. Their crews were briefed in hushed tones. Officially, they were listed as M4A3R3 flamethrower tanks. Unofficially, they were called Zippos, or simply Hellfire. Their existence was kept secret until the invasion of Iwo Jima. For the Japanese defenders, they would be a nightmare, without warning. While Americans prepared their flame tanks in guarded Hawaiian workshops, on Iwo Jima, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi continued building his subterranean labyrinth. His genius was not in blind fanaticism, but in disciplined engineering. Unlike many of his peers, he had studied in America, traveled its vast landscapes, and even met its people. He understood the industrial weight America could bring to war. He also knew he could not stop it. But he could delay it, and that delay might alter Japan's fate. Kuribayashi forbade his men from dying in futile banzai charges. Instead, he ordered them to dig. Miles of tunnels were bored into the volcanic rock, connecting thousands of caves. Entire hospitals functioned underground, lit by electric generators, stocked with supplies for months. Command posts lay 60 to 70 feet deep, safe from even the heaviest naval guns. Steel doors concealed firing slits. Machine gun nests overlapped fields of fire, creating kill zones where every step of ash could be swept by bullets. The fortress was not just military. It was psychological. Japanese soldiers were told they held the most formidable position in the Pacific. Their officers reminded them daily that American attacks would break against the island like waves against stone. They believed that in these tunnels, they were invincible. American intelligence failed to grasp the depth of the system. Aerial reconnaissance showed bunkers and gun emplacements, but not the living city beneath the island. After 74 days of bombardment, admirals assured Marines that little resistance remained. They expected 5 days of fighting. When Marines stormed the beaches on February 19th, they met a silence that seemed almost eerie. Then, without warning, the island erupted. Artillery, hidden in the hills, poured fire onto the crowded beaches. Machine guns raked the black sand, cutting down men by the dozens. Tanks bogged in the ash became perfect targets. By nightfall, more than 2,000 casualties lay on the shore. The fortress had survived. But Kuribayashi had overlooked one thing. His tunnels could resist bombs and shells. His men could endure hunger and thirst. They could fight to the last breath, but they could not endure fire. When the first flamethrower tanks opened their nozzles on February 20th, they turned his greatest strength into his greatest vulnerability. The underground city became a furnace. What followed was not simply combat. It was annihilation by fire. And the defenders who had been told to kill 10 Americans before dying found themselves suffocating in minutes, their courage consumed in the flames. On the morning of February 20th, the Marines were trapped. The beaches of Iwo Jima were killing grounds. Ash swallowed boots to the ankle, tanks bogged down, and every attempt to advance was met with a storm of fire from pillboxes that seemed impervious to artillery. The airfield ahead, Motoyama No. 1, was the key objective, but 3 concrete fortresses blocked the approach. Rifle companies were shredded again and again, reduced by 30% in less than 48 hours. That afternoon, Lieutenant Colonel William Duplantis made the call that changed everything. He ordered forward the flamethrower tanks, numbered 431 through 438. They looked like ordinary Shermans to Japanese eyes. Their secret was hidden until the moment of engagement. Staff Sergeant Robert Meza, commander of Tank 431, received the order. His crew had trained for this moment in Hawaii, but nothing prepared them for what awaited. The driver, Private First Class James Morrison, eased the 35-ton machine forward, treads grinding volcanic ash. Inside, Corporal Anthony Vitelli checked the gauges. Nitrogen pressure, 300 pounds per square inch. Fuel tanks full. Igniters primed. Gunner Corporal Thomas Carlson tracked the pillbox through his periscope. At 120 yards, Mesa gave the order. The hiss came first, a sound like compressed steam. Then the nozzle erupted. A stream of napalm-thickened fuel arced through the air and smashed into the aperture of the pillbox. Flames flowed inside like liquid lava. Oxygen vanished in an instant. Japanese defenders suffocated before the flames touched them. Seconds later, the interior ignited, ammunition cooking off in thunderclaps that cracked the concrete walls. Marine riflemen, who had spent 2 days watching comrades die, stared in awe. Where artillery had failed, where bombs had only scarred the surface, fire had triumphed in less than a minute. The second pillbox was hit with a 15-second burst. Its defenders tried to flee through rear exits, but Marines waited there with rifles ready. None escaped. The third bunker was hidden behind rocks, shielded from direct fire. Mesa ordered the tank closer, 80 yards, dangerously exposed. Japanese infantry surged from spider holes with satchel charges and magnetic mines. The bow gunner opened up, mowing down attackers, but several reached the blind spot behind the tank. Carlson swung the turret, and in a moment of innovation, made possible by the CBH-1 design, fired directly behind. The would-be attackers were consumed in an instant. Witnesses said it looked like the gates of hell had opened. By sunset, 3 fortresses that had stalled 2 regiments were reduced to burning ruins. Marines advanced 400 yards in 2 hours more ground than in the previous 2 days combined. Word spread fast. The tanks worked. The morale of an entire division shifted in one afternoon. For the Japanese, the shock was worse than the destruction. Reports to command posts described tanks breathing fire, consuming positions immune to shells. For men trained to believe their fortifications were invincible, it was like watching stone walls dissolve into paper. Terror spread as quickly as flame. News of the flamethrower tanks spread across Iwo Jima that night. Marines whispered about them in foxholes, describing fire streams that crawled into bunkers and suffocated entire garrisons. For the Japanese, the whispers were darker. Survivors of the first day's assaults staggered through tunnels, telling comrades that the Americans had unleashed machines that turned caves into ovens. General Kuribayashi received the first reports at his underground command beneath Hill 382. He had expected tanks, but not this. Anti-tank guns had been carefully hidden, their fields of fire overlapping. They had destroyed several conventional Shermans. But no defense existed against flame that flowed through firing slits, around corners, down ventilation shafts. The general recognized the threat immediately. That night, he issued new orders. Flamethrower tanks were to become priority targets. Every 47mm gun was to focus on them. Special assault squads of volunteers were formed, men who would strap explosives to their bodies and hurl themselves at the tanks. But there was a fatal problem. The flame tanks looked identical to standard Shermans until they fired. Japanese gunners could not distinguish them from a distance. Focusing fire on one tank meant ignoring others. By the time the nozzle hissed, it was already too late. The psychological effect rippled across both armies. Marines learned to wait for flame tanks before advancing. Infantry followed 50 yards behind, close enough to exploit shock, far enough to avoid the searing heat. Casualty rates in supported sectors dropped by 40% in a single day. Positions that had resisted for 72 hours fell in minutes once the tanks arrived. Japanese soldiers began fleeing positions at the sight of the tanks. For an army drilled to die at their posts, it was an unprecedented collapse of will. In one sector near Mount Suribachi, Sergeant William Patterson ordered his tank to fire a short burst into the air, not at a target but as a warning. Dozens of defenders bolted from caves, abandoning fortifications they had been told to hold to the death. Marines were so stunned that at first they failed to shoot. It was the first recorded mass abandonment of defensive positions in Japanese military history. The tanks developed new tactics as they fought. Corkscrew and burn became a signature maneuver, spiraling around bunkers to avoid anti-tank fire, while keeping a constant stream of flame pouring into sear apertures. Breach and clear combined flame with engineer demolition teams. A tank would burn out a position, then engineers rushed forward to seal it with explosives. The synergy was devastating. By February 21st, only 48 hours after their debut, flame tanks had destroyed 47 fortified positions and enabled advances of 600 yards in sectors that had been static. Japanese morale began to crack. One captured officer admitted that his men preferred death by bullet to the horror of fire. Surrender, once unthinkable, began to rise not in large numbers, but enough to show the weapon's unique psychological power. The Marines knew they had something extraordinary. The Japanese feared they faced something supernatural. And in the tunnels beneath Iwo Jima, where oxygen was precious and fire was death, even the bravest soldier could not fight flames. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent nearly a year transforming Iwo Jima into a fortress, unlike anything the Americans had ever encountered. He understood that he could not win. The island was too small, the sea and sky too dominated by American fleets and bombers. His mission was mathematical: inflict such a terrible price that Washington would hesitate before ordering an invasion of the Japanese homeland. He abandoned the old doctrine of banzai charges and open-field defenses. No glorious charges, no mass suicides in the first hours. Instead, he commanded his 21,000 soldiers to dig, to tunnel, to vanish beneath the volcanic rock. By February of 1945, they had completed 11 miles of tunnels, with plans for 17. The system reached 7 stories deep. More than 5,000 caves and chambers honeycombed the island. Some caverns were vast enough to hold 300 or 400 men. 1,500 fortified positions dotted the surface. Concrete bunkers with walls 4 feet thick, reinforced with salvaged steel, crowned every height. Each was positioned to provide overlapping fire. Machine guns, artillery, and mortars covered every approach. Even if Americans destroyed one pillbox, others could still sweep the same field. Hospitals were buried 75 feet underground. Ventilation shafts, disguised as natural fissures, provided air. Communications lines ran for miles beneath the ground, insulated from bombardment. Storage rooms held rice, water, and ammunition for a 2-month siege. Kuribayashi positioned his men with precision: 2,000 in the south near Mount Suribachi, 15,000 in the northern plateau, 4,000 in reserve. American intelligence had underestimated everything. They bombed the island for 74 days, dropping 6,800 tons of explosives. Naval guns fired 22,000 shells. Commanders believed the island would fall in 5 days. They were catastrophically wrong. Fewer than 200 of the 1,500 fortified positions were destroyed. The tunnels protected nearly every defender. When Marines landed, they stepped onto an island that was more fortress than terrain. Every ridge concealed a bunker. Every mound might open into a tunnel. Every cave mouth hid rifles waiting to fire. The beaches became slaughterhouses, not because the Americans lacked courage, but because the Japanese defenses were designed to consume courage and grind it into ash. Into this nightmare came the flamethrower tanks, machines that could do in minutes what artillery could not achieve in days. They turned Kuribayashi's greatest advantage, his underground fortress, into his men's tombs. On February 19th, the 8 modified Shermans had landed almost unnoticed, mixed among ordinary tanks. Their designation was M4A3R5, though Marines gave them nicknames: Hellfire, Corkscrew, Blaze of Glory. Most bore no markings at all. To Japanese eyes, they were simply Shermans. For 24 hours, they waited on the beaches while Marines died in their hundreds. By February 20th, the desperate need for progress forced their commitment. What followed reshaped not only the battle, but the psychology of both armies. The technical specifications mattered little to the men watching through gun sights. What they saw was a tank that hissed, then spewed liquid fire. The stream extended 150 yards, arcing into pillboxes and caves. Inside, temperatures soared above 1200 degrees Fahrenheit. Oxygen vanished. Men suffocated before fire touched them. The survivors burned alive in seconds. The Americans measured success in positions cleared, in yards gained. The Japanese measured it in screams, and in soldiers who refused orders to hold. For the first time, significant numbers of defenders abandoned their posts. Some fled deeper into tunnels. Others ran into machine gun fire rather than face fire. The samurai spirit that had sustained suicidal charges was collapsing under the weight of something even more terrifying than bullets. Japanese training had emphasized targeting flamethrower operators. In Saipan and Peleliu, soldiers had been ordered to concentrate fire on the man with twin tanks strapped to his back. Casualties among flame operators had reached 70%, but no doctrine prepared them for armored flamethrowers. The very concept was unimaginable. Fire that traveled under armor, directed with the accuracy of a cannon, immune to rifle bullets and grenades. Kuribayashi's men tried. 47mm anti-tank guns hammered the flame Shermans. Suicide teams rushed from spider holes with explosives. In some cases, they succeeded, damaging or disabling individual tanks. But the weapon's psychological impact was already irreversible. Marines advanced wherever the tanks went. Japanese soldiers who had sworn to die at their posts ran, surrendered, or hid deeper underground. The numbers from the first days were devastating. 47 positions destroyed in 24 hours. 600 yards gained, where before there had been none. Marine casualties in supported sectors fell by nearly half. The tanks consumed 10,000 gallons of fuel mixture in a week, but in exchange, they broke the myth of Japanese invincibility. For the Marines, they were miracle weapons. For the Japanese, they were nightmares of steel and fire. The morning of February 20th, 1945, dawned gray over the volcanic sands. Marines of the 21st Regiment were pinned down before Motoyama Airfield No. 1. 3 pillboxes commanded the approaches, their interlocking fire shredding every assault. 2 rifle companies had already been reduced to fragments. Men crouched behind shallow depressions, unable to move forward or back. Lieutenant Colonel William Duplantis knew he had to gamble. He called for one of the new flamethrower Shermans. Tank No. 431, commanded by Staff Sergeant Robert Meza, lumbered forward through the ash. To Japanese defenders, it looked like any other Sherman until the hiss began. Inside, the crew prepared with ritual precision. Driver Private James Morrison coaxed the 35-ton machine through ash that clutched at its tracks. Loader Corporal Anthony Vitelli checked gauges 300 pounds per square inch of pressure. Ready. Gunner Corporal Thomas Carlson adjusted his periscope, tracking the first pillbox. At 125 yards, Misa gave the order. Carlson pressed the trigger. A roar like the breath of hell erupted as liquid fire arced into the aperture. In seconds, the bunker became an oven. Oxygen was devoured. Concrete glowed. Men suffocated before they burned. Marines surged forward behind the wall of fire, rifles ready for survivors. Few emerged. A Japanese 47mm gun fired at point-blank range, the shell bouncing off the Sherman's frontal armor with a metallic scream. Mesa did not flinch. He traversed the turret, loosed another blast, and the gun crew disappeared in flame. The second pillbox fell. For the third, Japanese infantry tried rushing with satchel charges. Carlson swung the turret 180 degrees and incinerated them before they reached the tracks. In 2 hours, Marines gained 400 yards more progress than the entire previous day. Survivors spoke in awe. They had seen artillery, naval bombardment, even aerial strikes fail. But the flame tank succeeded, methodically, terrifyingly. For the Japanese, the impact was shattering. Survivors reported panic spreading through positions. Kuribayashi's orders had been clear. Do not retreat, do not surrender. Yet men abandoned their posts. Fear of fire outweighed fear of dishonor. The battlefield had changed. In the words of one Marine officer, "We discovered a weapon that won ground where nothing else could." If Mount Suribachi was the symbol, Hill 382 was the fortress. Rising from the northern plateau, it was honeycombed with tunnels, bunkers, and artillery nests. Marines called it the meat grinder. Attempts to take it had cost entire battalions, with casualty rates over 50%. On February 23rd, D+4, the flamethrower tanks were ordered forward. 4 Shermans advanced in echelon, supported by conventional tanks and a battalion of infantry. The Japanese were ready. Hidden 75mm mountain guns waited for them. The lead tank, number 433, took a direct hit to its track and was immobilized. Instead of retreating, the crew fired continuously, creating a wall of fire that shielded the others. Marines later said, the crew's sacrifice saved hundreds of lives. Tank number 434 targeted a main bunker whose aperture had been sealed with steel plates. At first, the flames splashed harmlessly. But Gunner Corporal Michael Rodriguez noticed the plates glowing red. He held the trigger far longer than doctrine recommended 45 seconds of continuous flame. The steel buckled, warped, and cracked. Fire poured inside. Ammunition cooked off in sympathetic explosions. Concrete cracked from thermal shock. Marines rushed forward with satchel charges, blasting entrances before defenders could reorganize. Hill 382's outer defenses collapsed in 3 hours. But the battle revealed limits. Tanks exhausted fuel after 80 seconds of continuous bursts. Refueling required 2 hours, during which positions could be reinforced. Tracks broke under volcanic rock. Transmissions failed from strain. Engines overheated. The machines were not invincible. Yet their effect was undeniable. Where flamethrower tanks operated, Marines advanced. Where they did not, men died in the hundreds. The Japanese recognized the new threat. Orders circulated to target flame tanks above all else. Suicide teams strapped explosives to their bodies, waiting in tunnels for the chance to hurl themselves at steel monsters. Some succeeded. Tank number 438 was destroyed on March 11th when a lone soldier detonated himself against its engine. But the cost was unbearable. Each Japanese life spent against one tank meant dozens of Marines survived elsewhere. The psychological shift was complete. Marines began postponing assaults until flame tanks could arrive. Infantry advanced 50 yards behind them, using their streams of fire as cover. Engineers followed close, sealing bunkers with explosives. The battlefield rhythm changed. No longer did Marines throw themselves against concrete in futile charges. Now the tanks burned a path, and men followed. Hill 382 was not just a tactical victory. It was proof. The flame tanks were not experimental anymore. They were indispensable. The terrain north of Hill 382 was a nightmare. Marines nicknamed one ravine the amphitheater, a bowl-shaped depression ringed with caves, pillboxes, and interlocking fire. Every approach was covered. Mortars dropped into the basin with mathematical precision. Machine guns swept the slopes, forcing attackers into choke points. Infantrymen described it as walking into a shooting gallery. For days, assaults had failed. Companies were reduced to platoons, platoons to squads. The black volcanic ash sucked at boots and swallowed bodies. Engineers tried satchel charges. Riflemen stormed entrances. Flamethrower operators crawled forward under fire. Casualties mounted. The amphitheater remained in Japanese hands. On February 26th, 3 flamethrower Shermans were brought forward. Their arrival was no guarantee of victory. The ground was broken, tracks bogged in ash, visibility reduced by smoke and dust. But there was no alternative. Tank number 436, commanded by Sergeant Daniel Foster, took point. His gunner, Corporal Anthony Vitelli, had already earned a reputation for accuracy. They advanced cautiously, infantry close behind. Japanese artillery zeroed in immediately, shells exploding around the tanks, fragments ringing against their armor. The defenders had prepared countermeasures. Steel shutters covered apertures, forcing flames to splash harmlessly outside. But Foster understood physics. He maneuvered his tank onto a mound of rubble, tilting the hull upward. At maximum elevation, Vitelli fired a long burst. The flame arced over the lip of the ravine, cascading down into the caves from above. Witnesses described it as liquid fire raining from the heavens. Japanese soldiers screamed, ran, or leaped from ledges rather than face burning alive. Marines surged behind the tanks, grenades and rifles finishing what fire had begun. The battle for the amphitheater lasted 6 hours. 17 fortified positions were destroyed, 300 defenders killed. Marine casualties were heavy, over 200 dead and wounded, but the position finally fell. Survivors spoke of the psychological shock. For the first time, defenders fled before the assault, rather than dying at their posts. A Japanese prisoner later admitted, "We had trained to fight bombs, shells, and bullets. We had no training for fire that flowed into every hiding place. The caves that gave us life became our graves." The amphitheater revealed the dual nature of the flamethrower tanks. They were devastating weapons, but also fragile machines. One broke a track on volcanic rock and had to be abandoned under fire. Another exhausted its fuel, forced to retreat while Marines held their ground alone. Logistics became as important as courage. Without constant refueling, the weapons were useless. Yet the lesson was clear. Flame tanks could succeed where nothing else could. On February 23rd, the same day the flag rose atop Mount Suribachi, a Marine corporal named Herschel Woody Williams entered history. The flame tanks had proven themselves, but the terrain often limited their use. Narrow ravines, collapsed tunnels, and sheer rock walls created dead zones where tanks could not maneuver. In those spaces, men still carried portable flamethrowers, 70-pound burdens of steel and fuel, strapped to their backs. Williams volunteered when his company stalled before a network of reinforced pillboxes. Covered only by 4 riflemen, he advanced alone. 2 of his escorts were killed almost instantly. Williams crawled forward, fuel sloshing on his back, every Japanese bullet aimed at him. He reached the first pillbox, jammed his nozzle through the firing slit, and unleashed fire. The interior erupted. He advanced to the next, flames driving defenders out where Marines shot them down. For 4 hours he fought, resting only to refuel. By the end, he had destroyed 7 pillboxes. Witnesses swore they had never seen such bravery. One officer wrote, "Williams accomplished alone what entire platoons could not." The Medal of Honor citation, awarded months later, recorded his courage in formal prose. But Williams himself rarely spoke of that day. He lived until 2022, the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from World War II. When asked late in life how he endured the memory, he answered simply, "I had to. If I didn't, my friends would die." His actions illustrated a paradox. The flamethrower tank was revolutionary, but the man-portable flamethrower still had a role. Technology and human courage complemented each other. Where steel machines could not go, flesh and blood carried the fire forward. For Marines at Iwo Jima, Williams embodied the brutal truth. Victory came not only from innovation, but from men willing to walk into hell with fire on their backs. By early March, the battle had shifted to the northern plateau, a place Marines named the Meat Grinder. Here, the volcanic landscape rose into jagged ridges and sulfurous pits, carved by centuries of geological fury. The Japanese had transformed this terrain into their final fortress. Every ridge bristled with guns, every cave mouth concealed a sniper or machine gun nest. The plateau was a maze of ravines, gullies, and cliffs. Tanks that had performed heroically on the southern beaches now struggled. Tracks snapped on razor-sharp volcanic rock. Engines overheated under constant strain. More than once, Shermans bogged down in ash pits so deep that crews had to abandon them under fire. But the flame tanks refused to be sidelined. Marine engineers adapted, cutting paths through the rock by night, building makeshift ramps and bridges under enemy fire. Spotters learned to use natural rock formations to bounce flames around corners. One tank, number 436, achieved the so-called impossible shot, perched precariously on rubble. Its crew tilted the hull to elevate the nozzle beyond its design limits. The arc of fire curved over a cliff and cascaded into caves below. Japanese defenders who believed themselves safe erupted in flames. Their sanctuary turned to ash. The shock reverberated across both sides. Marines began to believe no fortification was invulnerable. Japanese morale cracked as they realized even depth and elevation offered no protection. A prisoner later testified, "We thought we had built fortresses against bombs and shells, but fire is a liquid. It finds every hole." For the Marines, the plateau was proof that adaptation and imagination were as vital as courage. The flame tanks were no longer just support. They had become the tip of the spear. The climax of the battle came in late March, at a place Marines called the Bloody Gorge. Less than a square mile in size, it was a labyrinth of tunnels, caves, and ridges where Kuribayashi's remaining 3,000 soldiers prepared their last stand. The gorge was the embodiment of his doctrine: fight underground, make the Americans pay for every yard. On March 21st, the Marines unleashed their most concentrated assault of the campaign. 6 surviving flame Shermans, reinforced by 4 newly arrived Ronson-equipped models, advanced in crescent formation. Engineers marked cave mouths with phosphorus grenades. Infantry hugged close, rifles ready. The gorge exploded in fire. Napalm poured into openings. Flames bounced off stone to reach defenders hidden around corners. The tanks consumed over 8,000 gallons of fuel in a single day. Marines moved behind them, sealing caves with explosives. Japanese resistance was ferocious. Suicide squads rushed forward with explosives strapped to their bodies. One man hurled himself against tank number 438, destroying it and killing 3 of the crew. Others attacked vision blocks with concentrated rifle fire, trying desperately to blind the operators. But the tide could not be turned. By nightfall, 800 Japanese defenders were dead, many burned beyond recognition. Marines suffered nearly 300 casualties. Tragic, but far fewer than earlier days. For the first time, the Japanese fortress system collapsed in a single coordinated assault. The Bloody Gorge marked the end of organized resistance. Kuribayashi would continue to direct scattered attacks until his death, but the battle's outcome was sealed. For Marines, the gorge was the proof that flame tanks had broken the back of Japanese defense. For the defenders, it was the moment when their underground fortress became their tomb. By the 3rd week of March, the campaign on Iwo Jima had evolved into a crucible where ingenuity determined survival. The flame tanks, once experimental oddities, now stood at the center of American assault tactics. Entire battalions waited for their arrival before daring to move. Officers postponed attacks until the Shermans, with their lethal nozzles, rolled into position. The transformation was remarkable. At the beginning of the campaign, flamethrowers were distrusted, their short range and unreliability leading to catastrophic losses. Portable units had seen casualty rates above 70% in earlier battles. On Iwo Jima, thanks to armor and engineering, the survival rate of flame crews skyrocketed. What had once been a suicide assignment became a decisive weapon. The Marines refined a brutal efficiency. Infantrymen advanced 50 yards behind flame tanks, far enough to avoid the blistering heat, yet close enough to exploit the terror they created. Engineers learned to time demolitions with flame bursts, sealing bunkers before defenders could regroup. Observers began calling for flame instead of artillery. Even naval officers offshore adjusted bombardment schedules, allowing tanks to move forward first and dictate the pace of operations. Fuel became the critical factor. Each tank carried enough thickened napalm mixture for little more than a minute of continuous fire. In practice, gunners rationed flame in bursts of 2 to 3 seconds. Still, a day's combat consumed thousands of gallons. The logistical chain stretched back to Hawaii, where chemical units mixed precise formulas of gasoline, diesel, and napalm powder. This mixture had to be used within 72 hours before separating into sludge. Supply officers called it the most temperamental fuel in the Pacific, but they made sure it flowed without interruption. The Japanese adapted, but always too late. They reinforced apertures with steel plates, only to see them buckle under sustained fire. They dug escape tunnels, only to find flames followed air currents. They trained suicide teams, but Marines learned to protect tanks with interlocking rifle fire. The defenders could destroy individual machines, but they could not stop the innovation that drove them. On the plateau and in the ravines, the lesson repeated itself. Imagination was as lethal as bullets. The construction battalion engineers, who had worked in anonymity in Hawaii, had created more than a weapon. They had given Marines a method to rewrite battlefield arithmetic. Where artillery had failed, fire succeeded. Where courage had faltered, invention carried the day. Even with armored flame tanks dominating headlines, the battle proved that man-portable flamethrowers still had a terrible role to play. On February 23rd, near a ravine called the Amphitheater, flame tanks bogged down in volcanic ash and could not advance. Japanese bunkers rained fire on pinned infantry. Into this hell stepped Corporal Herschel Woody Williams of the Marine Corps Reserve. He weighed scarcely 140 pounds, but strapped to his back was a 70-pound M2 flamethrower. Covered by 4 riflemen, 2 of whom would not survive, Williams crawled forward across open ground. He rose within 30 yards of the nearest pillbox and triggered a burst. Flames roared into the aperture, silencing the guns. He advanced again and again, methodically clearing one fortification after another. For 4 hours, Williams stalked bunkers like a solitary predator. He burned 7 pillboxes that had withstood artillery, mortars, and direct tank fire. He crawled back for refueling, then returned each time, never hesitating despite concentrated sniper fire. When the day ended, Marines had advanced across terrain that hours earlier had seemed impregnable. Williams received the Medal of Honor for his actions, presented by President Harry Truman later that year. His citation described how his unyielding determination and extraordinary heroism inspired the entire unit. Yet Williams himself downplayed his deeds, saying he only did what had to be done. In later years, he admitted the memory of screams haunted him, a burden carried in silence until he began speaking publicly about it decades later. His story illustrated the dual reality of flame warfare. Technology multiplied by courage could achieve miracles, but it also left scars invisible to outsiders. Williams would live to the age of 98, the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the Second World War, his life a bridge between the era of fire and the modern age. The juxtaposition was striking. On one hand, anonymous engineers welding pipes in Hawaiian warehouses had built machines that transformed strategy. On the other, a lone Marine with a portable flamethrower embodied individual valor. Both were indispensable. Together, they demonstrated the fusion of human courage and industrial power that defined American victory on Iwo Jima. By the middle of March, the battle for Iwo Jima had become a war of logistics as much as firepower. The flame tanks, devastating on the field, were insatiable consumers of the thickened fuel mixture that kept their nozzles spewing liquid fire. Each M4 Sherman, converted into a flamethrower configuration, carried roughly 290 gallons of fuel mixture in its internal tanks. At maximum output, that meant less than 90 seconds of continuous flame. Doctrine required shorter bursts, 2 or 3 seconds at a time. But even then, one engagement could drain reserves alarmingly fast. To sustain operations, the Marines developed a supply network as intricate as any battlefield maneuver. Special trailers, each carrying 300 gallons of napalm mixture, were hauled forward under the cover of darkness. Teams of engineers risked sniper fire to refuel tanks within earshot of the enemy. The mixture itself was volatile, a blend of gasoline, diesel, and powdered napalm that had to be used within 72 hours or risk clogging the delicate pumping systems. Supply officers nicknamed it liquid dynamite, a substance that could kill tank crews as surely as Japanese artillery if mishandled. Every day, flame tanks on Iwo Jima consumed close to 10,000 gallons of this lethal brew. Over the 36 days of combat, they would burn through more than 360,000 gallons, a staggering figure that underscored the industrial weight behind the battlefield. Behind the front, Seabees labored around the clock in makeshift mixing plants, stirring drums of fuel under camouflage nets to avoid Japanese air raids. Without their unheralded work, the flame tanks would have become useless, steel hulks within hours. The Japanese recognized the significance of fuel and targeted it with grim determination. Suicide squads attempted night raids on marine depots, hoping to ignite the volatile stores. In one attack, a handful of Japanese soldiers managed to detonate a small fuel dump, sending a geyser of burning napalm skyward that lit the night like a volcano. Yet the overall system held. Marines rebuilt, engineers remixed, and the tanks kept firing. For tank crews, fuel meant survival. When gauges ran low, commanders faced agonizing decisions: withdraw to refuel and risk losing momentum, or press the attack with dwindling reserves, gambling that the last burst of flame would be enough. Many chose the latter, sometimes winning battles with their final seconds of fire. Others were caught empty, reduced to using only machine guns, while Japanese defenders regrouped. In those moments, the limitations of technology became brutally clear. Still, the balance tipped decisively in the Americans' favor. The sheer capacity of industrial production, the ability to ship hundreds of thousands of gallons across the Pacific, transformed flame from a novelty into a strategic weapon. For the Japanese, no amount of courage or discipline could alter the fact that, once fire began flowing into their tunnels, their positions became tombs. Fuel and firepower, harnessed by engineering and delivered by steel machines, were breaking the spine of the island's defenses. If there was a single place on Iwo Jima that embodied the horror of flame warfare, it was the gorge north of Hill 382, a twisted labyrinth of ravines and caves that Marines grimly nicknamed the Bloody Gorge. Here, in late March, the final remnants of General Kuribayashi's garrison prepared for their last stand. Roughly 3,000 defenders, many wounded and starving, clung to an area scarcely 700 yards across. They had fortified it with interlocking caves, concealed artillery, and spider holes connected by tunnels. It was the most formidable defensive knot remaining on the island. Into this furnace rolled the flame tanks. 6 of the original 8 Shermans remained operational, reinforced by 4 additional vehicles rushed from Hawaii. Though these reinforcements were equipped with the older Ronson systems, shorter ranged and less reliable, they added weight to the coming assault. The Marines planned a coordinated attack. A crescent formation of flame tanks would advance together, their overlapping jets of fire ensuring no position escaped destruction. On the morning of March 21st, the assault began. At 1,000 hours, the tanks moved forward, their engines growling through the volcanic ash. Marine riflemen followed 50 yards behind, ready to storm the caves once the fire had done its work. Engineers carried satchel charges to seal survivors inside. The air quickly filled with smoke and the chemical stench of burning napalm. The Japanese resisted with fanatical intensity. Suicide squads charged from spider holes, explosive charges strapped to their bodies. Anti-tank guns fired until their crews were engulfed in flame. One officer emerged, wielding a samurai sword, charging directly at Tank 434 before being cut down by rifle fire. These acts of desperation slowed, but did not stop the inexorable advance of steel and fire. The gorge became a vision of hell. Flames arced into cave mouths, turning oxygen into suffocating poison. Ammunition stores ignited, sending secondary explosions echoing through the ravines. Marines advancing behind the tanks described the ground littered with burned bodies, some fused into grotesque shapes by heat and pressure. The very rocks glowed from sustained flame contact. Volcanic stone transformed into molten fragments by temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. By sunset, more than 800 Japanese defenders lay dead in the gorge. Marine casualties, while not light, were a fraction of what they would have been in a conventional assault. 92 killed, 257 wounded, a price grim but bearable compared to the annihilation flame had inflicted on the defenders. Yet the psychological toll was immense. Tank crews reported nightmares of screams echoing inside their turrets. Maintenance teams found charred remains clinging to tracks, requiring blowtorches to remove. For many, the gorge symbolized not just victory, but the unbearable cost of the weapon they wielded. The bloody gorge marked the effective end of organized Japanese resistance on Iwo Jima. Within days, Kuribayashi himself would fall, leading a final banzai charge that ended his life and the battle. But the gorge remained etched into memory as the place where technology and fire finally crushed the samurai spirit, leaving behind only ash, silence, and scars that survivors carried for the rest of their lives. When the guns finally fell silent on Iwo Jima at the end of March 1945, the battlefield bore little resemblance to the volcanic island the Japanese had spent a year fortifying. Black sand beaches were churned into graveyards of steel. Hills once honeycombed with tunnels now belched smoke from collapsed galleries. And scattered across the shattered landscape stood the Sherman flamethrower tanks, their olive-drab armor scarred, their nozzles still blackened with soot. They were more than machines. They had become symbols of a new kind of war. 8 modified M4A3 Shermans had arrived on the beaches on the second day of the invasion. 6 of them survived to see the end. In their 36 days of combat, they destroyed more than 1,000 fortified positions, consumed over 360,000 gallons of napalm mixture, and were credited with reducing American casualties by at least 5,000. Yet their impact went beyond statistics. They altered the psychology of warfare itself. Japanese soldiers, taught to fight to the death, surrendered rather than face the horror of liquid fire. Positions considered impregnable collapsed in minutes. The samurai ethos, forged across centuries, had no defense against technology that could pour flame into the deepest tunnels. For the Marines, the flame tanks were lifesavers and nightmares all at once. Infantrymen followed them into battle with renewed confidence, knowing that bunkers which had resisted artillery could now be silenced. Yet tank crews lived with memories they seldom shared. Many admitted decades later that the smell of burning fuel mixed with human flesh haunted them long after the war ended. They carried scars invisible to civilians, memories of screams cut short, of charred bodies stuck to their tracks, of the awful realization that victory had come through incineration. Historians would later credit the flame tanks with changing Marine Corps doctrine permanently. The concept of combined arms, armor, infantry, engineers, and specialized weapons working in harmony became the foundation of post-war assault planning. In Korea, flamethrower tanks once again cleared bunkers at Heartbreak Ridge and the Punch Bowl. In Vietnam, armored flamethrowers, based on the M113 armored personnel carrier, carried the lineage forward until their retirement in 1978. Though eventually banned by international convention, the principle they embodied lived on. Innovation could turn the tide of battle faster than courage alone. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the flamethrower tanks was the lesson they taught about imagination. General Kuribayashi himself had warned Tokyo in his final messages. The Americans were winning not only through numbers, but through superior creativity. He called the flame tanks proof that imagination, harnessed by industrial power, could defeat even the strongest fortress. His prediction proved correct. Future wars would be fought with missiles, drones, and cyber weapons, each the product of nations that dared to reimagine how wars could be fought. In that sense, the flames that rolled through Iwo Jima did not die with the smoke. They ignited a revolution in military thought that continues to this day. When the guns finally fell silent on Iwo Jima at the end of March 1945, the battlefield bore little resemblance to the volcanic island the Japanese had spent a year fortifying. Black sand beaches were churned into graveyards of steel. Hills once honeycombed with tunnels now belched smoke from collapsed galleries. And scattered across the shattered landscape stood the Sherman flamethrower tanks, their olive-drab armor scarred, their nozzles still blackened with soot. They were more than machines. They had become symbols of a new kind of war. 8 modified M4A3 Shermans had arrived on the beaches on the second day of the invasion. 6 of them survived to see the end. In their 36 days of combat, they destroyed more than 1,000 fortified positions, consumed over 360,000 gallons of napalm mixture, and were credited with reducing American casualties by at least 5,000. Yet their impact went beyond statistics. They altered the psychology of warfare itself. Japanese soldiers, taught to fight to the death, surrendered rather than face the horror of liquid fire. Positions considered impregnable collapsed in minutes. The samurai ethos, forged across centuries, had no defense against technology that could pour flame into the deepest tunnels. For the Marines, the flame tanks were lifesavers and nightmares all at once. Infantrymen followed them into battle with renewed confidence, knowing that bunkers which had resisted artillery could now be silenced. Yet tank crews lived with memories they seldom shared. Many admitted decades later that the smell of burning fuel mixed with human flesh haunted them long after the war ended. They carried scars invisible to civilians, memories of screams cut short, of charred bodies stuck to their tracks, of the awful realization that victory had come through incineration. Historians would later credit the flame tanks with changing Marine Corps doctrine permanently. The concept of combined arms, armor, infantry, engineers, and specialized weapons working in harmony became the foundation of post-war assault planning. In Korea, flamethrower tanks once again cleared bunkers at Heartbreak Ridge and the Punch Bowl. In Vietnam, armored flamethrowers, based on the M113 armored personnel carrier, carried the lineage forward until their retirement in 1978. Though eventually banned by international convention, the principle they embodied lived on. Innovation could turn the tide of battle faster than courage alone. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the flamethrower tanks was the lesson they taught about imagination. General Kuribayashi himself had warned Tokyo in his final messages. The Americans were winning not only through numbers, but through superior creativity. He called the flame tanks proof that imagination, harnessed by industrial power, could defeat even the strongest fortress. His prediction proved correct. Future wars would be fought with missiles, drones, and cyber weapons, each the product of nations that dared to reimagine how wars could be fought. In that sense, the flames that rolled through Iwo Jima did not die with the smoke. They ignited a revolution in military thought that continues to this day.